Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Franklin Pierce, and the focus is Kansas-Nebraska and popular sovereignty. The year is 1854, and this is Pierce's second full year as President of the United States, and his country is being challenged in debate on similar topics that have been raging now for several years. The implementation of the compromise measures from 1850, including the Fugitive Slave Law, which is so disliked in the North but seen as essential in the South. And there's still a lot of angst over the potential expansion of slavery into territories. A lot of that had been focused on the territories that had recently been acquired from Mexico, the vast lands of New Mexico and California. But now another territory was coming into play for these debates, and that's the territory of Nebraska. This was a vast swath of land in the sort of the northwest prairie region of the American holdings, and it was essentially empty. There were no white settlers, there was no governance in this area. There were some Indian tribes, lots of animals, jungles and forests and things like that, but the American settler had not really gone into any of this territory, but there was a desire to do so in manifest destiny, moving across the continent and establishing American governance in each of these areas. The challenge, of course, comes back to slavery expansion, as it seems like it already did, and this goes back to the compromise that had been reached in 1820. The Missouri Compromise, that dictated that slavery was forever banned from the territory acquired from France called Louisiana above the 3630 parallel. That was the southern tip of Missouri. Anything above that, anywhere across the continent, slavery was forever banned. Well, the South was looking to abrogate that part of that agreement. They wanted to be able to bring slaves into that territory if it was going to be populated, and this was already creating a bunch of agitation. Well, at the center of this debate was Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois. He was pretty animated by trying to get that land populated because he wanted to build a transcontinental railroad across the northern stretch of the country that would go right through his home state of Illinois. And so he had a way of doing this. He believed that the answer actually came from the Compromise of 1850, when the territories of New Mexico and Utah were brought into the country and the locals were given the opportunity to decide whether or not they wanted slavery. This is what they called popular sovereignty. And Douglas thought this was completely democratic. This is what the American country was doing for states. States decided for themselves whether or not they could have slavery. They did it now in the recent compromise measures. He thought this was a natural thing. Let the people go and vote for themselves whether or not they wanted to include slavery into their territories. Well, the South was in favor of this, but the North was absolutely against it. They didn't want any more expansion of slavery as a whole. They were already upset about the Fugitive Slave Law that had recently been passed. They certainly didn't want to get rid of the Missouri Compromise. That had stood for 35 years, and they were happy to keep it standing. Well, Douglas moved forward in his Committee on the Territories in the Senate, and it emerged on January 4th of 1854 with a bill in which all questions pertaining to slavery in the territory were left to the decisions of the people residing therein, putting popular sovereignty into law, which would essentially get rid of the Missouri Compromise. Interestingly enough, even the South wasn't happy with this. Why? They didn't think it went far enough. They wanted a provision in this law that would specifically and outright repeal the Missouri Compromise, leave nothing to question, and then they would be able to go and populate it and at least get slavery in some of that section. Well, President Franklin Pierce wasn't so sure. He was not a fan of the Missouri Compromise and that he had some constitutional concerns about it, but it had been around for more than 3 decades. It served the country reasonably well. It certainly had calmed things in the 1820s and 30s, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for a radical change. But a crucial vote was coming up on Monday, January 23rd. We say Monday because nobody knew exactly where Pierce stood, and Stephen Douglas and his compatriots wanted to know where the president stood, but Franklin Pierce didn't take meetings on Sunday. This was a day off for him as he observed religious holiday. Well, he agreed to take the meeting. This was that important. Douglas and his colleagues came, and initially Pierce cautioned them. So look, this is a big change. I'm not sure if we're ready for this. Truly getting rid of the Missouri Compromise is a big deal. But he sat, he listened, and they convinced him. They convinced him enough not only to agree, but to write it down. Stephen Douglas didn't want to leave that room with any ambiguity before the big vote that was going to take place in Congress the next day. And sure enough, Franklin Pierce wrote out that the Missouri Compromise had already effectively been superseded by the principles of the legislation of 1850, commonly called the Compromise Measures, and is hereby declared inoperative and void. And the people of a territory or state are left perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic institutions in their own way. Domestic institutions, again, meant slavery. This was a big change, and this really brought an uproar from a lot of people in the North. One of them was Senator Salmon of Ohio, who spoke for many when he called it a bold scheme against American liberty, a monstrous plot, a violation of a sacred pledge, a criminal betrayal, and an enormous crime. All of those phrases were commonly being echoed throughout the North. Well, once they introduced the measure and Pierce had written down his support for it, he went all in. He put his full force of his administration for the passage of this so-called Kansas-Nebraska Act, as there would eventually be two territories that were decided upon. Nebraska was split. Nebraska territory would be on the northern portion. The Kansas territory would be immediately south to it. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had no trouble getting through the Senate. That was pretty easy. The House was going to be more difficult. It came up finally for a vote, or it came into the House actually for discussion on March 21st of 1854, but they tried to bury it. The people who were against it used some parliamentary procedures to try to not even bring it up to a vote. Well, Franklin Pierce was not going to be denied. In this case, he used the power of patronage to his advantage. He found 13 Democrats who were willing to change their votes in areas where their constituents did not want the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In fact, 12 of these 13 were denied re-election, but they did switch their votes, and of those 12, almost all of them weren't out of work for very long because Franklin Pierce gave them jobs as well, pretty prominent positions, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed on May 8th of 1854. Again, there were howls from the North. Future presidential candidate James Blaine later said the Kansas-Nebraska Act did not merely call forth opposition. It produced a frenzy of wrath on the part of thousands and tens of thousands in both old parties who had never before taken any part whatsoever in anti-slavery agitation. You now had the Fugitive Slave Law, you now had the Kansas-Nebraska Act. A lot of people in the North really angry with Franklin Pierce. That derisive nickname of Doughface was being thrust in his direction all over the place. Again, Doughface being a Northerner who seemed to be politically sympathetic to the Southern cause. But Franklin Pierce frankly thought this was nonsense. All he was doing was enforcing the law, upholding the Constitution, and frankly, what could be more democratic than popular sovereignty? This was giving the locals the opportunity to decide this for themselves. He saw nothing moral associated with this because slavery was sanctioned in the Constitution. This was his political ideology, and he frankly never wavered from it. He was a strict constructionist, and he took this on in other areas as well, including vetoing other popular legislation that he just didn't think passed constitutional muster in his mind. Some of this was in the form of federally funded internal improvements, so-called river and harbor bills that were very popular. Congressmen wanted to get that federal money to go back and do these improvements back in their own local constituencies, but frankly, Franklin Pierce saw no constitutional permission to do this. He was a consistent veto and opposed when these measures came. All this did, frankly, from a legislative standpoint, was alienate more people in Congress, making his job that much more difficult, but he stuck to his ideological beliefs. Then there came the case of Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix was a crusader for the mentally ill, which had not been well served in the United States up to this point, and she was rallying both the population and politicals to be able to come to the aid of the mentally ill in the United States, and she had an idea. To open up some more land sales and give portions of the proceeds of those land sales back to the states, specifically to establish hospitals for the mentally ill. This was a very popular measure by this point, passed both houses of Congress, and on May 3rd, Franklin Pierce vetoed it. He vetoed the popular measure because, again, he found it to be unconstitutional. According to Pierce, I cannot find any authority in the Constitution for making the federal government the great almoner of public charity throughout the United States. To do so would, in my judgment, be contrary to the letter and spirit of the Constitution and subversive of the whole theory upon which the union of these states is founded. That's a very different mindset, of course, than what we have today, but this was still federally funded internal improvements and other measures that were not specifically sanctioned as enumerated powers in the Constitution. They were still strict constructionists, like a Franklin Pierce and was not going to put his name to it. Well, Dorothea Dix, unfortunately, had her whole plan lost with this veto. She said of Pierce, "The poor, weak president has by an unprecedented extremity of folly lacerated my life." Serious setback for the mission of Dorothea Dix. The congressional session ended on August 7th. President Pierce went to Capitol Hill, tradition, to sign legislation, put his signature on those bills on that last day before the congressman left town. When he was leaving the Capitol, he was on his way to his carriage, an inebriated man from South Carolina approached him and offered to share a drink with the president. Well, the president declined. He turned, and he was immediately struck by a hard-boiled egg that took his hat off. There's a little bit of an ominous sign and a little bit about the flavor of the way things were going for Franklin Pierce. This was tough times, and it was only going to get tougher because now that the Kansas-Nebraska Act had passed, he had to go implement it along with popular sovereignty, and that would be no easy task. In fact, it would mostly accelerate the nation on the path to national fracture, but that is the story for another day. That is Franklin Pierce, Kansas-Nebraska, and popular sovereignty from the life of Franklin Pierce. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.